When making a classic tomato sauce like we are today, there's really two modes of thinking. There's the French way and there's the Italian way. And really, these people have been fighting for a very long time as to who actually came up with these sauces. They're pretty similar, but there are some key differences. The French version of this mother sauce actually sometimes begins with the roux, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't, it usually begins with salted pork, sauteed, adding in the mirepoix and the tomatoes, and then they actually add in a ham bone. They let it simmer for 2 to 3 hours. That's a long process. The Italian version is just more simple. There's no ham bones or pork, it's just tomatoes and mirepoix and Italian herbs and a lot less simmering time. Decided to go a more Italian route to this mother sauce just because it is much more doable in the average person's time. It's going to begin by a lot of cutting, so get ready to brush up on your knife skills. We're going to start by preparing a mirepoix, what the Italians call sofrito, but no matter what you call it, it begins with carrots and onions and celery. It's a great, very flavorful, aromatic combination that's going to lend our sauce a lot of flavor. Make sure everything is small dice. We will, however, go ahead and mince the garlic cloves just to make sure that more garlic flavor is released without us getting any big chunks of garlic later on. Our mise en place is complete. 1/4 of a cup of olive oil, our mirepoix, our crushed tomato, garlic, sugar, salt, and some seasonings that you'll see us add later on. We're going to start by adding our olive oil to a pan, bring it up to about medium heat. I don't want to add in my vegetables immediately to that oil. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and let it heat up. I'll know that it's ready when I start to see just a little bit of shimmer across the top of the surface. And it looks like we're there, so here comes the onion. And the carrots. And lastly, the celery. And now we're going to saute. We definitely want to make sure that all of the mirepoix gets coated in the oil to start, and then we want to keep it moving from time to time just to make sure that all vegetables get cooked, so we keep them moving in the pan. And here's what we're waiting for. Take some time. We want to see that the onions become translucent. Doesn't mean necessarily that you can see through them, but as you notice right now in the pan, the onions are pretty bright white. But what will happen as time goes on is those onions will definitely become a lot more clear looking, and that will tell us that they are cooked through. The celery and the carrots definitely won't be cooked through at this point. That's okay. They'll simmer for a long time in our tomato sauce that's coming. So it's just about truly getting those onions to be cooked through, letting everything sweat, as they call it, and we want to make sure that some of those flavors start to get released. And they really do smell good. Be patient. You can't rush it. This process takes time. Hopefully you can see a big difference now. We see that those onions definitely do look translucent. So here comes the garlic. At the garlic adding stage, I like to make sure that I keep the vegetables moving because we don't want the garlic to burn, and if it does, it'll just become really bitter. We're just waiting for this garlic to become wonderful smelling or aromatic. That will tell us that it is ready for the next step. If you wait too long, it might burn, and that's no good. So just a couple seconds, then comes the crushed tomato in this case. I have done this recipe honestly with whole peeled tomatoes. I've even had diced tomatoes because I was short a can. You can use whatever tomato product really at this stage that you want to. I like the crushed tomatoes because it just does make your job a little bit easier going forward. We will want to then go ahead and reduce the heat to low just so we have a gentle simmer in the pan. This is also when we will go ahead and add any of our fresh herbs or any of the herbs that are going to need longer to release their flavors. Bay leaf is a good example of that. It's dried, but it is one that needs to simmer in sauces to reduce its flavor. I'm also adding a little bit of crushed red pepper just because I like a little bit of spice in a sauce. So I'm just stirring those in, and as it simmers, those flavors are going to be released. Now is also a really great time to get some meatballs going if you would like to do that. I would also highly recommend starting your pasta water if you're assuming that you're going to be making this tomato sauce with some pasta. I'm going to be using bucatini today, which is a thick noodle, sort of similar to a spaghetti, but thicker. It has a hole down the middle of the spaghetti as well, which sucks up some of the juices, which I like. And I will then remind you, don't forget to salt your water. Well, we've talked a lot about that. This is what your sauce looks like about half of the way into the simmering time. So after about 15 minutes, see we've got a gentle simmer going and it has reduced some. That's exactly what we want. Here's what your sauce will look like after about 25 minutes. Almost there. You're starting to notice that it's a lot thicker. With just a little bit of simmering time left, here is when you're going to add any of your dried herbs if you'd like to do that. I'm adding oregano, thyme, and basil just because it's a great combination. Our dried herbs don't take as long to release their flavors, and so that's why you're seeing me add those at the end of the process versus adding them at the beginning. Whatever you add, always, of course, make sure that you taste it so that you get a good idea for the flavors that you're developing. Then you'll want to go ahead and make sure that you take out any of your parsley stems. Your bay leaf will be helpful to take out too. And then you'll add in your kosher salt and your sugar. I would recommend most of the amount that your recipe tells you to, but of course you always want to taste and see if it is what you want. Found that second bay leaf. There it was hiding from me. It's always helpful to taste and just make sure that you have the flavors that you want. And at this point, they'll be pretty developed. Is where your recipe gets a tiny bit dangerous, so please beware of hot liquids. We are going to transfer the sauce into a blender. You could also use a food processor if you have one. If you don't have either of those, you could also use an immersion blender. I think the blender is really helpful and handy just because of the size and the amount of liquid it can hold. So I'm transferring the sauce over. The whole purpose of this is to puree those larger chunks of the vegetables down smaller. You can skip this step, it'll just be a chunky sauce, but I think it's better for the consistency that we want to achieve. This is where you just have to be really careful. The food processor or the blender just pulse and make sure that you have a firm hold on the top of the blender just to make sure it doesn't splatter out at you. Then beware of the steam that will release. We'll want to make sure that we put this back into then the pan where it came from. We're going to bring it back over to the stove for it to meet our pasta. This is what it'll look like. I know it kind of looks odd at this stage, but don't worry, it's going to be great when it all comes together. Some people say that it looks funny. We're going to take our al dente pasta and you will put it into the sauce. I'm just transferring it with tongs just because a little bit of the pasta water doesn't hurt anything at this stage. In fact, you'll see me add some pasta water into the sauce later anyway. I'm stirring, making sure to evenly coat that pasta as quick as possible so there's not any sticking. It's looking a little thick, so I'm going to add in some pasta water. You can add as much as you feel you need for the consistency that you want. You don't want to add too much, obviously. We've worked really hard to reduce it and get this thick texture of the sauce, but it does definitely help to make the sauce come together. And it's ready. It's time for plating. I would encourage you, if you're using a longer pasta like this, try that nesting technique that I showed you. I'm just using a serving fork, a slightly larger fork, and my tongs to twirl it around the fork and then move it onto the plate. Adding a couple spoons of the sauce. You can do that if you'd like. There's always some more underneath all those noodles. Here come the meatballs, and then for garnishing, of course, Parmesan cheese, always a good idea, and I've also minced up a little extra parsley just as adding a splash of color. And then always make sure it's good to clean off your plate, make it look perfect. And there you have it, classic sauce tomat.